and try to ratify that, saying that this is your piece of land. And now we go back to them to learn about organic farming. We go back to them to learn about indigenous methods and Ayush methods of healthcare. Yet we don't give them their space. Yet we don't give them their place to live. And yet they are happy. This is the irony. And we would benefit a lot from your talk because we want to grapple with this irony. And all of us are social activists, all of us are social workers, and you have done so much of work in social change. You guide us, you help us, you handhold and be with us in tackling this. When we are talking about climate change, for example, not only in Orissa, but in many parts of this country, we are now, it's a reality. We are now facing climate change. We are facing climate disruptions in a big way. Every 3 months, every 4 months, we have something or the other happening either in the hills, in the coast, in the forests. And yet we claim that we have the largest forest cover, the green cover. And you know what forest cover means? It means the canopy of green. So, are there any primary forests left? Are we cutting down the primary forest? Yes, of course, we are doing that. And do we say that by doing this, our GDP will grow and we'll have a better life? Big question mark. We all know the answer. Yet, we are running after all this. So, there are many paradoxes, there are many ironies. You know that, we all know that. But I'm trying to bring all these to the fore so that we could probably find windows of acting in these areas. All of us are well-meaning people, and CARD is organizing this. And I would not think it would be an exaggeration to say that this is probably the biggest such webinar or such conference happening, thanks to the technology and thanks to the efforts of CARD. Even on Sundays and Saturdays and weekends and weekdays, we congregate, we gather to discuss about important things. And with your timing and time zone differences, you agreed to have this after a change in schedule. We are thankful to you. And we are, Professor Datta, we are actually trying to find ways around woke capitalism. How do these companies, natural resource companies, extraction companies, I'm talking to you about a few indigenous communities and their forest areas and their lands. What would they do? What are the youths trying to do? Are they going away from farming? What will happen to their livelihoods? How do they decolonize? We still are colonizing them. We have been colonizing them. So please share your thoughts, your ideas, and we are willing to go ahead, all of us, with you, and we would urge you to go along with us. Thank you, Professor Datta, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, to request Professor Srinivasalu NS from National Law University, West Bengal, to go for a quick opening remark about Mohan Dutta and his work. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Vikram. First of all, many congratulations to Center for Adivasi Research and Development Center, because they have almost completed 200 programs since last year on this issue of Adivasi development. And today's program is special because we are focusing today on decolonization and the climate change impact on tribals. I would rather say that the tribal empowerment is actually hit by civilization. We call that the so-called civilization is very much required for the development of the society. But the so-called civilization is minus human values. The civilization plus human values can empower society. Civilization minus human value would destroy the society. And the best example is what is happening at our forest lands, where our indigenous peoples are having their habitats. So in this program on tribal epistemology, decolonization, and climate change, I would rather focus on this angle of thought as well, because decolonization, in a way, should empower tribal communities. And as I said, without human values impact or influence no society can develop, including the so-called civilized societies that we are having in today's time. Of course, this climate change is not just about change in the environment, but a change of climate as far as the thinking of the mankind is concerned. As one of my colleagues was mentioning, that we are labeling them as tribals, uncivil, thinking that they are only fit to live in forest and all. But we are going back to them to learn certain things with respect to farming or our maintenance of health and all. On this planet, every living being, I'm not just talking about human being, every living being is having its own right to enjoy the life. But because of the so-called civilization, we are undermining the human values. And then this climate change should happen at the thinking levels of the people who are actually labeling certain sects of people as a tribal or indigenous. They are actually the sons and daughters of the motherland, because their contribution to the earth, their contribution to the climate, environment, forest cannot be measured in any terms. But the kind of contribution the so-called civilized society is making in destroying the habitats, in destroying the environment, and that is actually resulting in climate change. They are contributing for the maintenance of climate, environment, but the so-called civilized society is actually damaging the climate. And whatever climate, whatever environment forest that we're having now, 1/3 or 20% of the land is because of these tribal people who are actually living very close to those forest lands or in nature. And then we should remember, we should recognize their contribution, and that kind of change in the thinking climate should also take place, and decolonization should happen in our mindset as well. Our mindsets are still in the colonial hangover in terms of thinking somebody to be tribal, somebody to be uncivil, somebody to be civilized, somebody to live in big cities, metros and all that. That is again colonial thinking. And we have to decolonize our thinking. We have to change the climate in our attitude and our thinking. And I hope with this brief overview, my loaned colleague and today's speaker would try to give much focus on this aspect towards empowering tribal populace, tribal development in the process of decolonization, and as well the climate change in terms of people's attitude and the way they think. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Srinivasalu. Now I would like to, before I would like to Professor Mohan Dutta, I would share some few lines. I am a student of Professor Mohan Dutta in IIT Kharagpur, and then this entire World Human Science and Management Conference is the brainchild of Professor Mohan Dutta. And big thank you to you, sir. Today is a big day for us and a big show for us. Now I would like to invite Professor Mohan Dutta for he initiate his talk. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking you, Bikram, for inviting me to this conversation. It's an honor to be here with you. I also want to begin by apologizing to you all for my mistake last week, because I miscalculated the time zone and the time difference. So very sorry for that. I also want to thank Rudra for setting up the agenda of the center, Professor Panigrahi and Dr. Srinivasalu for setting up the framework, and Dr. Nupur for that beautiful and humbling introduction. I will begin by acknowledging the indigenous people of this land, the Tangata Whenua of Rangitane, who inhabit the land where I sit, and the displacement of whom forms the basis of these structures where urban development has been carried out, and the university where I sit has been built. So I think that is the beginning point of this talk, is for us to recognize that the knowledge structures that we sit within often are built upon indigenous land, are built upon the land of the Adivasi people, and their displacement forms the basis of the knowledge claims processes of knowledge generation that we participate in. I'm going to share my slides. So when talking about indigeneity, decolonization, and climate change, today I will draw upon my work with indigenous communities over the last two decades to give you an understanding of the context of my work. My earliest ethnographic research was with Santals. Santals are the Adivasi peoples of Eastern India. You find Santal inhabitants all the way across Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and West Bengal. My earliest work with Santals was in an area called Poshchim Mednipur or West Midnapur, in a space called Jungle Mahal. Now, Jungle Mahal, to many of you would be familiar as the site for indigenous uprising or Adivasi uprising in the last decade. The work that I have done with Santals in Jungle Mahal has been around understanding indigenous epistemology and the ways in which indigenous epistemology guides the kinds of knowledge claims that we can make. I also want to acknowledge the work of activist collaborators, and particularly the son of soil of Orissa, my good friend Samarendra Das, who played such a vital role within the context of the indigenous movement of the Dongria Kond in Nyamgiri. And I thought it would be relevant for me to draw upon the Nyamgiri case study as one of the case studies that I will share some insights on. And I ask for your forgiveness if I repeat information that already you're familiar with. So in setting up the concept of indigeneity, what I will do is first define indigeneity and look at the ongoing struggles in terms of the definition of indigeneity and situate these struggles, particularly within the context of India. Then I will describe the culture-centered approach, which is the framework that I have been working with in terms of looking at the ways in which the concept of indigenous sovereignty or the sovereignty of indigenous people serves as the basis for making claims to knowledge, and then connect that to the politics of climate change, particularly looking at the questions of land rights and the question of climate resilient agriculture. So I want to begin by highlighting that the problem of indigeneity, or the question of indigeneity that I am interested in, focuses on this question of communicative inequalities, which is based upon two key ideas. First idea is, how are information and voice resources distributed in society? So this is from my work, from the work of the center, and actually this is many activists, community researchers that work on this project, including Dalit and Adivasi women farmers in Telangana. This is situated within the context of Pastapur and Warangal, that are sites of large-scale farmer suicides, situated in the backdrop of the massive onslaught of neoliberal agriculture. And this particular piece of work that is in collaboration with Deccan Development Society, or DDS, which comprises more than 50 sanghams. These are cooperatives that are created, owned, and run by the women farmers, mostly landless women farmers, seeks to take back agriculture and practices of agriculture and agricultural knowledge, connecting agricultural knowledge to indigenous systems and ways of knowing, and particularly with the concept of crop diversity and crop pluralism. So really trying to connect back to the diverse ways of doing agriculture that are increasingly threatened by this monolithic, monotheistic form of top-down neoliberal agriculture that seeks to impose technology-enabled BT varieties, for instance, within the context of farming across India and certainly in Telangana. So here you see this image of these children on a bullock cart that is carrying what the farmers call the seed banks. These are the banks that store the diverse varieties of seeds. And as they travel on this bullock cart across communities, they distribute the seeds freely for anyone to grow. Now, this comes across as a juxtaposition in the backdrop of the neoliberal form of agriculture that is market-based, market-driven, where the seed has been privatized and commoditized and then has to be purchased through participation in the market. And then, of course, along with the purchasing of the seed, you have to purchase the accompanying technologies, all the way from needing to purchase irrigation systems to feed the seeds, to fertilizers, to pesticides. So in this backdrop, the struggle of the women farmers is one of how do you own information and voice resources so that the knowledge of the community can serve as the basis for the practices of agriculture. So you see, in this sense, communication is the infrastructure that enables knowledge to be generated and that enables for communities to participate in practices of doing agriculture. Now, the key challenge for the women farmers here, and key challenge for many indigenous communities across the globe, is that they are increasingly erased and disenfranchised from communication infrastructures, which in turn carry top-down, privatized, commoditized messages, promoting privatized, commoditized solutions. In this case, BT crops are promoted through the local radio, through large-scale advertising, through posters that are put up in the communities. And along with that, then a seduction is sold into the farming communities, which is, as Dr. Panigrahi talked about this, the seduction of growth, the seduction of generating profits through privatized, cash-based agriculture. So within that context, the struggle of the women becomes a struggle for storytelling, but it also fundamentally becomes a struggle for creating, owning, and distributing the community knowledge, the knowledge that is held within community networks, so that that can be the basis for transformative practices of agriculture. Now, this work has been really powerful because through their ongoing practices, the women farmers, for instance, have demonstrated that practices of growing plural and diverse crops in the fields can actually help, first of all, retain soil fertility and soil nutrients, which is a major problem within the context of neoliberal technology-based agriculture that tends to deplete the soil of the nutrients and rich resources. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they have brought about transformations in growing forms of crops that are climate resilient, crops that can grow with minimal amount of water. So jawar, bajra, millet, and for instance, their innovations with growing millet has formed the basis of the millet network, which now has really, starting from agrarian communities and their practices of indigenous agriculture within particular settings, has now built connections globally across communities in the global south in building strategies for growing climate resilient crops. So distribution of information and voice resources and ownership of information and voice resources are at the heart of indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty of indigenous practices. So community-owned knowledge, therefore, is generated through these practices of owning communication spaces and resources. So in this context, the women, and here you see that they are actually planning what to grow in their collective field. So they're doing this collective decision making, and what you see them having plotted out is the different fields, and then they're planning what kinds of seeds to grow in these fields to maintain the crop diversity. As they are doing this, this itself is work of communication, but through the work of communication, they're actually participating in epistemological work of methodology to produce empirically based knowledge based upon their lived experiences. Simultaneously, they are documenting this work within this context through video storytelling. So they own these cameras, they own a local community radio station. Through these communication infrastructures, they're able to then circulate and disseminate this knowledge. So the site of knowledge generation, in that sense, you think about it, moves away from the modernist, hegemonic, neoliberal structures of knowledge production in the university, and in the university that is sold into the logics of corporate capital, to the village, to the field, or as in Maori, which are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, to the marae. Marae is the space where Maori communities here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, come together. And knowledge, therefore, is generated through the work of generating life and life forms, through everyday conversations where people come together, and it is fundamentally anchored in people's lived experiences. So communities in this sense, and that is the fundamental work of decolonization, is to recognize the theory generative capacities of communities, that communities, especially communities at the margins, those that have been historically erased, the subaltern, is capable of generating theories, but not only that, that the subaltern participates on an everyday basis to create practices through the work of participating in theory building. This then becomes the basis for ownership of community democracies, where communities own democratic processes of decision-making and knowledge generation, and create pedagogies, forms of learning about democracies, but learning about democracies so that indigenous people or Adivasi people can have sovereignty. So it is much like the practices of what the theorist Gayatri Spivak talks about, learning to learn from below. So we learn to learn from the subaltern margins through the process of creation of these democratic spaces and habits of democracy, and learning together the everyday habits of democracy. So communities in that sense, Adivasi communities become sites for knowledge generation through the co-identification of the material resources that are necessary to transform these dominant structures that erase and displace Adivasi lives. And that becomes a basis for creating or co-creating voice infrastructures, because after all, it is through voice that we can imagine transformation, working alongside communities to identify spaces of support, the kinds of support that would be necessary in order to sustain community activism and community praxis, and simultaneously to think about what are the kinds of safeguards that are necessary, because when Adivasi people have a voice, and when they do gain a voice, and we see this historically happen, that the dominant structures come down with either strategies of co-option, where they will co-opt the Adivasi strategies in order to serve the interests of private capital and market, or through strategies of repression and violence. So really safeguarding infrastructures are they're critical. We have often seen within the context of indigenous movements of Adivasi people, that these movements have been labeled as anti-national or labeled as Maoist, which often becomes the framing that enables the state to deploy military, to deploy police, to deploy violence, to silence the indigenous struggles for sovereignty. So within that context, then we have to think about how do we co-create both material and symbolic interventions that can transform these structures and ultimately driving structural transformation. So that is the crux of the culture-centered approach and its framework of indigeneity and decolonization, that the work of building indigenous infrastructures for sovereignty is fundamentally about transforming that structures that erase, displace, and co-opt indigenous life and livelihood. So through this process then, and this is an example of an Adivasi school, this process of owning knowledge structures becomes the basis for transforming spaces, but transformation in a way where indigenous children, Adivasi children, not only learn the habits of democracy, but they also learn the knowledge systems and the knowledge structures of indigenous communities that they actually connect with and intergenerationally pass down or carry out the knowledge that is held within indigenous context through dance, through storytelling, through songs, through learning to respect trees, nature, river systems. And again, that is often passed through oral forms of communication. And this process of transformation then, and this is from my fieldwork in West Bengal in Jungle Mahal, this process of transformation then is fundamentally about reconfiguring democracy, because when you have created these voice infrastructures and Adivasi people participate in those infrastructures, that becomes the basis for owning democracy. That becomes the basis for laying claims to democracy, through learning how to write petitions, through learning how to approach local councils, panchayats and municipality systems, through learning how to raise demands with the state structures, through learning how to work through the legal frameworks in order to protect indigenous land, resources, and knowledge. And this then, and I use the example of CG Net Swara, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is based upon this idea that communication enables democracy. So in CG Net Swara, you have distant rural communities that are often disconnected from urban infrastructures, actually calling into that technology through mobile phones that are available to them to share news from within their communities. And that is an example of voice infrastructure and creativity in that infrastructure in order to democratize spaces of participation. This is another example with the work with the women farmers. And here you see that they have a community meeting where they are making decisions. And you see one of them actually having a notebook, another one having a video camera. So through these forms of witnessing and note-taking, they are actually documenting knowledge. They are circulating knowledge, but also they are building interventions into the dominant hegemonic neoliberal structure of private capital that sort of would rather push top-down privatized agriculture. So let's go from this then to ask about this question of indigeneity in context, and particularly within the context of India. So the concept of indigeneity in India is contested. It is contested because the hegemonic structures seek to co-opt the language of indigeneity in order to serve hegemonic interests. So you find the sort of ongoing narrativization of indigeneity, for instance, carried out under the ideological umbrella of Hindutva that seeks to define all Indians as indigenous, and or rather, I would say that Indians that are Hindu as indigenous, and that process then simultaneously marks the Muslims and the Christians as outside of the sphere of the nation. So that's one kind of othering that drives the hate of the Hindutva ideology. And at the same time, this ideology simultaneously co-opts the participation of indigenous communities, erases the struggles of Adivasi people, and takes over these spaces by claiming indigeneity for Hindus. So that narrativization then, and you think about this within the context of the reworking of the various migration theories, want to project a fascist ideology that see Bharatvarsh as Bharat Mata, that is the site of all Hindus that are the original inhabitants of India with the Hindu Sanskriti or Hindu culture and a Hindu Jati. Now, that process then of defining indigeneity in that kind of way fundamentally does the kind of violence that erases India's Adivasi people, India's indigenous people who struggle every day with land, with their access to water, with their access to natural resources. And those struggles get erased, and at the same time, they get co-opted. So one of the things you see increasingly across indigenous spaces is the targeting of these spaces with Hindutva agendas. So you see RSS shakhas come up across indigenous communities, the Ekal Vidyalayas, that seek to perpetuate this hegemonic top-down agenda while doing so under the language of doing good for the Adivasi people. And actually, that contestation becomes a vital site of erasure, because through that process then, and we see this happen here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where then upper caste Hindus claim that they are indigenous and therefore seek solidarity with Maori, and which is really disingenuous and duplicitous, because it actually erases their caste privilege, or hides or obfuscates their caste privilege on one hand. And on the other hand, it erases the reality of the struggles of Adivasi people in India. So it's really important to think through this, because increasingly, one of the alarming things that I see happen within the context of India and South Asia is the co-optation of the term decolonization by Hindutva, which fundamentally we have to fight against, because it is a contestation over terminology. It seeks to colonize, ironically, the decolonizing work that needs to happen within the context of Adivasi struggles. So recognizing this contestation is fundamental for us to think through what does decolonization really stand for. So decolonization in this sense, and this is critical for how I'm going to define decolonization, it is about the struggle for land, for water, for livelihood, for access to nature, knowledge and ownership of knowledge. So indigenous struggles in India then can be thought of in terms of 7 key features. First is the definition of indigeneity. In our ongoing struggles have to this book by side nonsense, because it portrays a Hindutva ideology and talking about dharmic systems as decolonization, and it completely takes over the definitional terrain that ought to be thought of and conceptualized within the context of Adivasi struggles. The second point I want to bring up as this is happening is the ongoing violence that is perpetrated on indigenous people by the nation state, particularly through its deployment of the police and the military, and acts like the Sedition Act, the UAPA, are often deployed on indigenous people in order to displace them from their spaces of land and livelihood, in order to remove them from the forests that are their spaces of livelihood, that are their homes. Simultaneously, there are processes of co-option, which are often carried out under the language of development, under the language of corporate social responsibility. So development in that sense is top-down development that are imposed upon indigenous peoples. Of course, increasingly we see the turn to participation, the turn to culture, so that this is all packaged to look good. This is all packaged to be appealing, so that we can run a World Bank project and say, oh, we have had the participation of indigenous people, and then carry out the extractive mining programs and displace the people. So it becomes a process of incorporating Adivasi people into these processes that fundamentally remove them from spaces of livelihood. In this backdrop, then, we have increasing struggles of indigenous peoples with poverty. One of the things that I've seen on an ongoing basis in my work in West Bengal is the struggles with hunger, the struggles with food security, and extreme poverty in many communities. So it's an irony, because on one hand, there are development programs that are pushed on communities, and on the other hand, indigenous people are often displaced from the spaces of livelihood that would enable them to have access to social mobility. In a lot of my work, I've also seen the struggles of indigenous people with health, so that the mortality and morbidity indicators for Adivasi peoples are much lower compared to the broader population. And that is to be situated within the context of the racism of the dominant structures, the lack of access to adequate resources. So often in many indigenous communities, we do not have access to hospitals and healthcare systems. And when you do find access, these systems are built upon upper caste structures. So they continue to perpetrate atrocities and dehumanization of Adivasi people. And then connected to all of this is the deployment of technologies, where technologies are proposed as fixes for indigenous people, while actually continuing to erase them from spaces of livelihood. So development in this sense works on trickle-down logic, where the overarching ideology is that development will trickle down to the poorest. And of course, that doesn't translate within the context of indigenous lives. So economic growth is pitched as a solution to poverty, ironically, by displacing people from their lives and livelihoods. And access to capitalism through open markets is thought about as ushering in development, while basically what that translates into is processes of extraction and expulsion for indigenous peoples. So if you look at the global economy in terms of the concentration of resources, what you see is that the neoliberal era has actually continued to exacerbate the inequalities. And these inequalities are not just within nation states, but they also actually play out spatially. And at the same time, what has happened is nation states within have become more and more unequal. So the process of growth has worked to consolidate power in the hands of few, while continuing to disenfranchise the majority. And of course, those at the very bottom or those at the very margins have been further marginalized. So within this backdrop, then if you think about what does decolonization mean, decolonization is fundamentally about dismantling the dominant systems of knowledge production and the claims they make. So within this context, it is about decentering the dominant theories, the theory that continues to drive social change globally is modernization theory that looks at the growth as a linear process that moves communities from a state of primitiveness to a state of modernity through communication technologies that bring about transformation. So this is sort of the early communication theory proposed by Rastow, Lerner, Rogers, Schramm. That ideology continues to dominate, and certainly, when you think about the 2021 India, and on one hand, the projection of the narrative of decolonization, and on the other hand, the projection of smart cities and smart urbanism and smart development, it is pretty much the regurgitation of the modernization theory and the modernization framework. So what is really ironic here is that the language of decolonization is on one hand incorporated to perpetuate more hate and a politics of hate, and on the other hand, it works through this turbocharged vision of hyper growth and economic growth as a basis for modernization. So this kind of a framework is fundamentally based upon the production of the primitive, and this you see in the classic work of Lerner that we use in communication theory. And here you see this kind of a linear framework, right, where he's saying that increasing urbanization tends to raise literacy. Literacy will increase media exposure, which in turn will bring about wider economic participation and political participation that will develop people. As we have seen, this was in late 1960s, as we have seen over the last 6 decades, this really doesn't play out. In fact, this process, what it does is that it continues to produce greater and greater disenfranchisement of the margins, and particularly so of the Adivasi people. I use this example as an exemplar of the modernization moment for India. For those of you that are old enough to remember, I mean, I say that I'm a child of neoliberalism because I came to sort of grow up in the 1990s, when Doordarshan was starting to show these programs. There was a serial Hum Log that was being run, and at that point, that became the basis for advertising driven media production, and Maggie 2-minute noodles was one of the sort of first ads that sort of brought in this model. And one of the things, and this is of course projected as that model of growth driven by advertising driven communication platforms. And what it fundamentally doesn't seek to ask is that these platforms were telling whose stories, whose messages were being disseminated through them. And think about it, DD at that point was a public platform, right? And with what agendas and what goals and for what purposes. And what you see happen within that context then is that the narrative of development carried through these media infrastructures are the narratives of the dominant hegemonic actors, while continuing to raise the narratives of the indigenous people. So democracy works here within this framework alongside technology in order to serve the interests of capital, work, and that works through the incorporation of the subaltern into this process of generating profits and framing that as empowerment. So the process of the incorporation of the subaltern into the economy is narrated as participation, as the process of empowerment. So where then does the subaltern find an anchor to transforming these hegemonic structures? And for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to argue that that lies in the process of sovereignty, in the process of indigenous sovereignty and through the process of participation in resistance to transform these dominant structures. So the subaltern as a site of profiteering, where the subaltern is incorporated into these global monetary flows of financial capital, is resisted through the everyday grassroots theories of the global South that are generated from the everyday lives that you saw in one of the first images that I shared with you, that create the basis for practical interventions, such as in the example of the seed banks for the women farmers. I was going to share with you the examples of the women farmers, but I will skip that. But what I want to argue then here is that by building spaces for representation and recognition of the Adivasi voice, you actually create possibilities for transforming the structures and addressing the structural inequality. So in that sense, the challenge with indigeneity and particularly of indigenous peoples is fundamentally one of communication and one of creating communicative infrastructures for the voices of indigenous peoples to enact sovereignty. So the meanings that are generated through the participation of indigenous peoples become the basis for demonstrating agency, which then become ways of actually carrying forth cultural stories, cultural forms of knowledge, which are ever dynamic and ever changing, but that then serves as the basis for transforming the structures, as is in the case of indigenous agriculture. So communication as decolonization then is about transforming these processes of knowledge production and information sharing. So we have to ask these questions: who owns information and knowledge, for what purposes, who produces knowledge, and what are the subject and object positions in knowledge configurations? So to transform this, we have to move to the ethic of communication as listening and as listening to voices of indigenous margins. So we work through the erasures, the spaces, the voices that have been erased to foreground articulations that disrupt the silences. And these disruptions become the basis for imagining alternative socio-political economic structures, and listening then as a framework makes impure your dominant categories, dominant notions of development. So say, for instance, the notion that the river is sovereign and it has its sovereign rights, so the forest is sovereign and it has its sovereign rights, becomes a basis for rendering impure the dominant structures and for actually creating legal frameworks for protecting and safeguarding our forests within the context of climate change. So this was the case study of the women farmers I was going to walk through. I will skip through this, but the basic argument here is that seed diversity is one of the fundamental ways in which we can actually respond to climate change, particularly in terms of addressing food insecurity and climate resilient crops. And this is where we see the kinds of innovations that are brought about through indigenous participation. And the voices of women farmers here are telling that if you give us, or if we actually have ownership of these forms of knowledge generation, that's when we can transform these spaces. Here they are going in this procession with the seeds that they are carrying, and the seeds are given out not by any market logic. You don't have to pay for them. You just come when you need the seed and you collect them. And then the idea is that when you have your crop and you have the seeds, you bring them back into the bank. But that's sort of an overall normative framework without any process of writing it in or conceptualizing it as a form of debt. And this is the example of Vedanta mining in Niyamgiri. You're familiar with this example, I hope you are. I just want to highlight a few key points that, what we saw with the Dongriya Kond in Niyamgiri is something Dr. Panigrahi talked about, is that indigenous people globally today, and this is sort of the resource curse, right? That they sit upon those vital resources that are the extractive sites of neoliberal capital. So the frontiers of neoliberal capital is actually extractive capitalism, because as capitalism runs out of spaces to exploit, it is actually going to reach out to the remaining forests and remaining natural resources in order to expel them. And indigenous people happen to sit on these resources. So our challenge in that sense, in terms of thinking through this concept of climate change, is also fundamentally of indigenous resistance and retaining sites of resistance to challenge these dominant forms of neoliberal capital. So when you think about the interplays of mineral wealth and forest, those of you in Orissa are well familiar with the forest cover. That is also where the extractive industries seek to find their ways in. And of course, they do that not only through the police and the military, but also through corporate social responsibility, or CSR. So if you think about the communicative infrastructure of Vedanta, that was based upon the language of community development and community social work and caring for the community. That is the ultimate irony, right? So transnational capital coming in with extractive industries and doing so under the language of doing good for the Adivasi people. So that communicative inversion, the turning of materiality into its opposite, is often how capital actually deploys its extractive logics. And of course, this is propped up through communication infrastructure. So you had the Our Girl, Our Pride campaign, and that became the basis for whitewashing Vedanta within this context, and portraying Vedanta as a transnational corporation that was doing good and bringing India into the next century. Yeah, and what is really key here is the interpenetration of various forms of private capital and celebrity capital in order to hold up this extractive logic. Now, think about it in terms of the concept of communicative inequality I talked about in the very beginning. On one hand, you have massive consolidation of power and communication infrastructures in the hands of global transnational capital. On the other hand, for the indigenous people to tell their stories, to narrate their stories, the communicative infrastructures are virtually or materially erased on an everyday basis. So even the spaces of participation, like the Schedule 5 mandates for consultation of indigenous people, are actually deployed in order to erase indigenous participation, so that they are done through these manipulative ways that are actually meant to sort of deceive people, that are meant to minimize their participation so that a decision can be passed and then the extractive industries can come in. This is Lado Sikaka, and again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. He talks about how the indigenous people are very much aware of the financial capital and the financial forces of capital that are deploying strategies of seduction in order to co-opt. Remember, I talked about co-opt, and at the same time deploy violence to silence. So within that context, resistance through continual critical reflexivity and awareness becomes the basis through which one can challenge these hegemonic structures. This is that beautiful song, Gaon Chhora Nahi, which sort of articulates in indigenous voice the notion of development, and it inverts the idea of development and how it is sold to indigenous people, really asking what is development, whose development, for what purposes, and who really benefits from it. So I remember the one part of this narrative where the song is being played out, and the song says, "Tum piyoge Bisleri cola, Pepsi cola." You will be drinking all these bottled drinks. while our waterways, sources of our drinking water, will be completely destroyed. And the power of this movement was, again, through those communicative infrastructures to narrate the story that actually demonstrated the effects of Vedanta in the communities, where the pollution that was being created, the impact on the health and well-being of community members, the destruction of waterways, those become ways of generating knowledge. So decolonizing knowledge in communication for social change, then it's about building registers for solidarity. So within the context of Vedanta and the struggle of the Dongriya Kund, and this was one of the most beautiful things that we saw with the struggles of the Dongriya Kund, which was the connections and the global networks of solidarity that emerged not only within the local spaces in terms of the participation of the people in the protests and the Gram Panchayat meetings, and then through the legal processes and court systems, but then the work of activists, of Foil Vedanta in Britain, and holding Vedanta Corporation to account within the legal infrastructure there. Because global capital is fluid, the ways of resisting that also has to be built through solidarity that actually is fluid and that is built upon connections. So communities at the margins of the margins then can actually transform. Indigenous people can transform these spaces. They can transform the kinds of challenges that we see today with climate change by redefining sites of power, by regaining power to tell their stories, to generate their knowledge, through habits of dialogue and inclusion, where through these reflexive spaces in communities, they can produce knowledge that can be the basis for transformations. This is something I want to wrap up with. Because of COVID, I usually spend quite a bit of time in India. And because of COVID, for the past 2 years, I haven't been able to travel in the communities where I do my work. And this is in one of the Santali communities. And you see here the children passing books. And this is one of our community researchers who is working with them on education. Education is the basis for democracy. So grassroots community pedagogies of participating every day through literacies, through knowledge systems, becomes a way for indigenous knowledge to transform. And I offer the Maori concept of Kaitia Kitanga, which means that to safeguard, to be the stewards of our resources for the future generations. That is the fundamental knowledge that indigenous people give us. How can we be the stewards of these resources, rather than destroying them so that then we can live upon some seductive imaginary of the next rocket to Mars and the colony in Mars? We have to inhabit this earth and we have to make it inhabitable. And in that sense, we have to absolutely urgently recognize the rights of indigenous people as legitimate producers of knowledge. And this becomes the basis for us to practice democratic habits that can actually offer us a basis for challenging climate change. So I want to wrap up by asking you this question, and this is from a migrant worker who is also an Adivasi who had traveled to Bangalore from one of the villages where I work in West Bengal. And he says that, this process of expulsion has also meant that no one listens to our voices. So can we, for me, it is that habit of listening that is the basis for radical transformation. So, I'm just going to read out what he's saying. Can anyone hear what the worker is going through? What our pain is like? Can anyone even see us? I've been here with a whole number of us. There are so many people. This is what he's talking about when he was stuck there amidst COVID, and he was really scared because and you remember all these images of workers thrown into these urban infrastructures on these roads, traveling home without access to basic resources. Is that development? And he's saying there are so many people that are here. I'm worried that I'm infected because there are so many people here. We've also heard one worker who lived here has died. No one can see us. No one can see in this city. The Babus, meaning the middle class and upper class people, cannot see So I leave you with this question. What can we do to disrupt these erasures and to disrupt these processes of rendering Adivasi people invisible? Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for wonderful deliberation and very praiseworthy activism and academic-led informations. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, the subaltern expert and the writer of Adivasi Question and Fabrics of Time, to give a light to the talk of Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Vikram. Sorry, and also I don't know how to thank Professor Dutta for this wonderful deliberations and touching upon an entire range of entire gamut of concepts and categories that have really troubled the last, I would say, the moment that subaltern framework really evolved in the 19. I mean, the way this has this theoretical framework has been thought through has come up with new turns, and particularly for me, the great benefit that I got this morning is that listening a kind of idea about empowering indigenous communities, and also that what we have been also arguing in favor of creating more space for the margin to mainstream them. It is particularly coming from a communication expert like Professor Datta. It's absolutely revealing, is absolutely telling, and absolutely illuminating in many ways. I was looking at these some of the concepts that I've been hearing about his ideas based on your very critical takes on his kind of works that he have been doing for the last decades, 2-3 decades, and the idea of empowering voice resources, which is a very interesting concept that I came across from his talk, and how do we do that? The roadmap that he tried to show us that this is could be the way that we need to redefine democracy, the way we need to refashion ways of being human, and how this knowledge needs to be privileged against a very dominant hegemonic neoliberal knowledge structure is fascinating. Whatever the takeaway from this talk is absolutely clear. Only thing that I would like to flag here with Professor Datta is that, yes, of course, there is no denying this fact that we need to understand the nuanced, problematic associated with understanding the kind of understanding that capitalism has given us. The way we have tried to grapple with this question of understanding capitalism, linear history, linear politics, ideas, the narrative of development, the discourse of development, that has been all there. But now, when we talk of decolonization and particularly Adivasi epistemology, and trying to create a conceptual space for that kind of knowledge, how do we do that? That is the challenge. I think it's going to trouble us for another couple of decades. It's just not easy that to chart out a kind of roadmap and this is the way we can do it. Yes, of course. You talked about the very, what do you call this, very serious dominance of the nation state. And the nation state hardly leaves any space to think of other ways of doing things. As other things are evolving across the globe. We have been seeing in the last 10 years or something, even soon after this globalization, idea of globalization has come up. Is it not the time to think of some of the other issues concerning agency, question of knowledge formation, question of whether there is a need to have a kind of epochal consciousness going beyond this idea of a global framework. Can't it be something like planet which also tries to invite us to a kind of dialogue? In that way, I would like to, suggest that the idea of, having a kind of discourse where human remains at the center, or there is a humanocentric discourse with which we operate, can it be the only way, or we need to also go beyond that? We have to be somewhere non-humanocentric approach. We need to bring in non-humanocentric approach to reinforce this idea of decolonization. In other words, what I would like to say, that of human relationships to the non-human also becomes important. For example, you talked about Santals. I mean, you have worked on the Santals, and if you can remember from the colonial records itself, uh, the agency of the Santal as a community now it has been endorsed. If you remember that when the Kanu and Sidhu, the two major Santal leaders, when they were being interrogated by the colonial, the colonial masters or the judges, that why did you rebel? And they said that our Thakur said so, and that's why we rebelled. But at that point of time, most of the colonial anthropologists and historians tried to explain this by saying that they anthropologized the Adivasis, saying that this is their belief, and the tribals speak in that language. And when the subalterns started looking at them, including the initial phase of this subaltern collective, they tried to also explain the same way. Ranjit Gua also did this same thing, saying that this is, kind of what you call quote unquote backward consciousness, and with capitalism doing the round, and once it becomes modernized, they would, graduate to a different level of understanding, and they will be used to use the language of modernity and everything. So even subaltern historians and subaltern scholars struggled with this idea that somewhere, I mean, the agency, the question of agency has to be with the person who is, I mean, who is a historian who is trying to look at the subaltern question. He is the person who has to find out, figure out what kind of agency the Adivasi should have. Meaning thereby, what I want to stress thereby, that the idea of agency is always somewhat problematic, that we have never been able to figure out, because we tend to think that the within the global in the question of what you call this humanocentric narrative, that we tend to think that the consciousness has to reach a particular level, unless until we accept the fact that God can also be the agent of something, that he can be the real propeller, or he can be the real agent for initiating action. This will not be possible. This is the robust thinking, this is the robust feeling of the Adivasis. So we have not created enough intellectual space to accept these kind of ideas into our own understanding. I mean, when we try to, as social scientists, we try to analyze things, we tend to, dismiss it. We remain somewhat, we tend to be very, take it for granted, or we rubbish this idea. But at that point of time, we to, at least jump into, or at least try to stretch into those areas where non-humans, spirits, and gods can also be seen as kind of agents, which has very significantly been kind of missing agenda in the discourse of social science. So if we try to analyze these two questions of globalization, and because you talked about climate also, climate the question, climate justice, you talked about climate resilience, food ecology and everything. When we try to understand, I mean, try to integrate epistemology, tribal Adivasi epistemology, decolonization, and climate, one of the major theme that seems to me, which is very critical at this point of time when Lato Bruno is arguing in terms of a kind of thesis that how modern we have become so far, or in the context of this idea that modernity is a kind of very problematic category that we need to think through. And if we try to problematize both globalization and global warming and try to figure out this notion of globe, we see that this capital and force has propelled our ideas. Maybe somewhere we need to breach it. Maybe somewhere we need to puncture it, and maybe somewhere we need to think that the basis of social science, which has so far survived or so far been held true by making a distinction between natural science and human sciences, natural science and social sciences is collapsing. Somewhere at a philosophical level, we need to graduate to a kind of understanding where we need to bring these two as really as one. And I think global warming itself has told us to think through the major kind of thought that we need to at least acknowledge is that there is a multicellular life which is important. And this is very much revealing in the epistemological conceptual repertoire of the Adivasis of the margins, when they talk of the nature, when they talk about their livelihood, when they on the basis of their life practices, the dynamics of the life world of these Adivasi communities, we see that there is a lot of areas where reverence, elements of coexistence are there. And based upon a kind of very fascinating understanding, very thriving understanding between human and non-human.
Yes.
I think some of the ideas that is being churned out by leading theorists, by leading experts from different domains, social science, and also like communication field. I think we need to at least draw our attention to these kind of problems, that there is a question of, there is a need for having a epochal consciousness where we create a conceptual space for the understanding of the non-human, of the spirit, of God and everything. Because pushing it unendingly or pushing it without any kind of critical introspection, that somewhere we can or will be able to manage or will manage to fight the nation state, and will be able to create space for the margin to voice itself or mainstream the indigenous communities, is all right. But at the same time, it may not teach how to decolonize this idea of a very dominant knowledge structure. It's there. So unless until we in a planet, when I say planet, I basically mean that it has to decenter human. Human has remained at the center of all our understanding. Unless until we develop a non-humanocentric understanding, this decolonization will not be possible. At till about 90s and till about early part of this millennia, we're trying to talk about that we have absolutely, there is a very strong need on the part of the global south to decolonize in terms of at least dismantling the theories of these standard theoretical models of social science, whether it is modernization narrative, this is class conflict, this idea of liberalism, private space, public space, franchise, or democratic norms and everything. And these, because these are Eurocentric notions. But going beyond that, I think we need to bring in, because your talk basically focused on this idea of community engagement and community network, and the question of privileging voice resources. But one step further could be to also bring in this concept of planet, where we need to respect this multicellular life world, where a virus is important, where is a fungi is important, where the alga is important, where a god is important, where everything is important. Unless we, reach up to that kind of consciousness, what in 1950s, in the mid 1950s, Hannah Arendt talked about human conditions. But what is the human conditions today? How do we look at it? How do the social scientists, the natural scientists work together to figure out what exactly troubles us? How do we do that? How do we redefine this human condition? And this again brings me back to this famous Kantian question, which was flagged off in the 19th century, in the mid 19th century, when he said, "What is a man? What he can do? What he can expect for? What is his ultimate aim?" So all these questions are folded back to this question of man. And Kant said this precisely because of the fact that he believed in humanism. But now we have at least, I mean, I don't know how to put this millennia, but at least there has to be a kind of critical shift or critical interrogation of this question of human, where we need to perhaps start questioning, start interrogating this idea of a humanocentric narrative, and maybe somewhere we try to figure out what could be possibly the non-humanocentric narratives, with whose language, with whose grammar, with whose idioms we can start trying to, prescribe solutions for our kind of, what you call predicament, precarity, and whatnot. Thank you. But absolutely, it's enjoyable because of, I have to run to the airport but to go back. So sorry, but I'm going to engage with you in terms of your, kind of critical reflections that I saw in this morning, some of the ideas that you have talked about, and it's very interesting to look at for the viewers. It's really fascinating that I should share that we have been talking from our own, kind of comfort zone kind of situations, when we call ourselves as social scientists, or when we call ourselves as the students of history or politics or everything. We somewhat try to remain oblivious of the developments that is happening in some of these critical areas like communication and fascinating work. And as interestingly look at your bibliography, where you have talked about indigeneity and how to mainstream them, what could be the ways of mainstreaming voice resources. I was looking at a lot of references being made to many of these critical thinkers, obviously because of your activism, because of your engagement with community. These things have to be there. But also at the same time, some of the theories that you have brought in from the communication world, is it really something we don't know, not yet. So there is a lack of transdisciplinarity which is also happening. It's good that card is encouraging a kind of encouraging this kind of silences to be breached by bringing in people like experts like you. And we have been thinking of this idea that we should have people across human science. One of the major reasons that why we called it that it is not only to be confined to only human sciences. We added management, and also the very tacit understanding that scientists should also come and speak, so that uh, the domain of knowledge, the border of knowledge gets interrogated, and new ideas should come up and speak. So that the So I would be happy to see you, the way you intellectually engage with this new question of, now that this is being flagged, that it's not only globe, it has to be planet also, and this cannot be seen as a kind of binarized distinction. This has to be critical categories which needs to be interrogated differently to give us a more holistic picture of who we are and how do we do, and what is our what should be our agenda, both as practitioners of social science or kind of community activist at here at any part of the world, whether it is global north or the global south. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
for this kind words.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you
Yes.
for your great remarks. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Neha Sharma. Please read out the question and to Professor Dutta.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for a wonderful talk. This is no doubt a very fantastic talk of our series because of, even though I don't belong to this area, but this is these problems you pointed out and spoke, that is very fundamental for our understanding as a human being, as a human being, and we should all understand these problems like contestation, like so-called modernity, and the problem of monotheistic neoliberalism aspect you spoke. Sir, I will read some of the question which is there in the chat box. Do you want me to read each question or single question at a time, or I will sum up the questions at once?
Thanks so much, Neha. Before I go there, can I respond to sir a little bit, because I just wanted to thank him for those beautiful comments. It was so humbling to hear your comments. I just wanted to say that, and also say, that you made me think of something which sort of was the beginning of my ethnographic work, which is, when working with the Santals, one of the things that the Santals would say when talking about what causes poor health is that poor health is caused by the cutting down of trees, and that it's actually the spirits that reside in the trees, and when you cut down the trees, the spirits enter the human body, and that's what causes poor health. And I mean, what you offered as a conversation really made me think of that, because that was an invitation to really examine the question of the spirit, the question of agency outside of humans, so recognizing the agency in the trees and the jungles and forests. In our work with Maori communities, who are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a lot of our activism is around the river and the protecting of the river, where, of course, through Maori activism, the river has been accorded agency within the legal structure. So I think there is a lot to be thought through in that sense, sir, in terms of the cellular connections and the multicellular, multi-species forms of theorizing agency in a planetary way. So I will certainly think more about that, and I think that also really connects a lot to the kinds of activist struggles I'm engaged with. Thank you. Go ahead, Neha.
Yes, sir. Sir, the question is, first question
Just to
is,
thank you profusely, Professor Dutta, for this. I'll just keep in touch with you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. Take care, sir.
So there's a question from one of our audience, that how do you address the problem of climate crisis in this Anthropocene epoch, though we called it as Anthropocene or Capitalocene? The second question is from Chinmay, sir, and that is, can we identify Adivasis as Janjati as per our government regulation entitled in our democracy, on there is difference between the Janjati and Adivasi? Is there any difference between these two terms? There is another, there are two important questions of Subham Das, and one is regarding this dominant culture of the state. It is related to corporate driven education system, and the second is how you will see that how many this manipulation of the data in the media and artificial intelligence time and social media in the social media. So what is the how we look at look for this epistemic violence which is going on in the corporate nexus, which leads to cultural erasure by forcing them to assimilate with the dominant culture of the state through institutionalized manner of the corporate driven education system. So these are the major thing. These are the question. The other questions are, sir, about this one of the uh, slide which you mentioned, that co-creating material and symbolic intervention. And please, can you, if you elaborate more about this, because material and symbol, which is very difficult to understand, because symbolism is very transit and something not very concrete, and how many means it is from me, I don't know. And these are the questions, sir. Sir.
Thank you so much, Neha. Let me first talk about the problem of Anthropocene versus Capitalocene, and I think that goes back to our earlier conversations. If you really think about climate change as sort of constituted amidst sort of the large-scale consolidation of resources, it certainly is the nature of neoliberal capital and accelerated neoliberal capital. And in that sense, it is the crisis of capitalism, in a way that it is capitalism that has propelled climate change. Now, of course, if you can think about the question of Anthropocene in terms of the question of human survival, and more importantly, just going back to the earlier question of planetary survival, then what it means is that we have to figure out ways of disrupting and dismantling the ongoing capitalist structures and the neoliberal form of capitalism that perpetuates these sort of threats to the climate. Now, if you think about neoliberal capital as extremely resilient, one of the things that you're also seeing is that it comes up with ongoing strategies of adapting, co-opting, and transforming itself in order to co-opt. And within that sense, it also then co-opts the language of decolonization. It co-opts the language of cultural mobilization in order to consolidate global capital. I will give you an example of this. So within the Indian context, for instance, you see at least in terms of the state structure, a large-scale investment in sort of non-Eurocentric, decolonizing narratives. And at the same time, what you find is large-scale consolidation of power in the hands of capital, particularly in the hands of crony capital. So the Adanis and the Ambanis continuing to consolidate their wealth. And then when you look at the global reach of that in terms of Adanis, fundamentally threatening indigenous life and livelihood here in Australia, right? So within that context, what you also see is that neoliberal capital is extremely adaptive in its ability to incorporate languages of culturalism and decolonization in order to enable its further reach. So the challenge in that sense, I suppose, for us is both the interplays of Capitalocene and Anthropocene, but fundamentally about producing ruptures within these systems that actually enable for community voices, voices of indigenous people, voices of Adivasi people to reimagine our relationship with the environment, our relationship with nature in new and altogether different ways, which is of course not new for these communities because this is how they have been living their lives, but new within the context of the dominant logics of organizing politics and economics. I want to go to that question that you pointed out about Neha, the symbolic and the material. So the material refers to the everyday resources that are actually constituted in the formation of structures. So material, if you can think about it in very basic terms, it is your food, clothing, shelter. It is the base that forms the basis of everyday life and living, while the symbolic are the communicative artifacts, the communication resources that you deploy to represent the material. So when I say you have to think through how you reorganize the symbolic and the material, what that means is that your everyday organizing of basic resources, like your access to food, clothing, and shelter, is intertwined with how you reorganize your access to symbolic and communication resources. So this is where communication is really powerful, because it is through communication. I mean, you think about it, right? We are in the midst of some of the greatest challenges with resources today across many communities in the globe. Certainly, if you look at the current challenges in India with economic resources for a large section of the population, people are in the midst of real challenges and struggles, because prices are going up, things are being commoditized and privatized, and at the same time, people are seduced by a symbolic narrative. The symbolic narrative, they can say something like Hindu khatre mein hai, and that's all it takes for people to be diverted and occupied by that and not really think about their everyday struggles and the kinds of things they need to be thinking about, right? So that is an example of the interplay of the symbolic and the material. What was the other question, Neha?
Yes, sir. Let me rephrase that. One question is how we can, what is there any difference between Janjati and Adivasi, which is in the Government of India regulation, it is written as Adivasis, as Janjatis. And the other question is, other two questions, access of education, where the corporate driven education system, how we look from the problem of a very subalternist group of how which is there in the people, about the Adivasi people, but because there is epistemologic violence from the upper side. And the second question about the social media, how do you interlink between the Gramsci's hegemonic approach and the post-truth Indian society, where the state and political party are manufacturing public consent using manipulation of the data through artificial intelligence and social media? So these are the
Perfect. Perfect. So, first of all, Janjati and Adivasi, again, Janjati is a construct that has been created with particular agendas in terms of defining, co-opting, and diluting Adivasi struggles. So I prefer to use Adivasi because that is constitutionally recognized, and that gives an anchor for communities to organize in their struggles for resistance, particularly as they are being subjected to large-scale erasure and violence. In terms of this question about corporatization of education, I think that's a really good question. So education has been privatized, it has been corporatized, and that has been going on for years, right? I mean, I think about, when I went to IIT to receive, an engineering degree in agricultural engineering, and I think about, what we were taught in the curriculum at IIT. It was about sort of this privatized, commoditized, technocentric model of agriculture. There was absolutely nothing in that curriculum about the public role of agriculture, the role of agriculture in feeding the hungry. So what you see through that pedagogy is that people that came out of the IITs and the IIMs, they go on to serve the agendas of private capital and corporate capital, and not really to the questions of publicness and public goods, and how do you actually build and contribute to public goods. So that kind of large-scale cooptation of education within privatized logics has also meant that communities have very little space for their knowledge to be recognized, right? So in fact, a lot of what I was outlining in my work then is the work of building community democracy. So how do we, and you're right, that is fundamentally about, I talked about pedagogies of democracy. What does that mean? That how do we actually transform education, transform everyday processes of education so that those become spaces for first of all, understanding our public commitments as citizens of democracies, and second, and more importantly, create spaces for listening with humility, where Adivasi people can participate to articulate their worldviews, to articulate their knowledge systems, and to actually be able to have their voices be heard. So not just to participate so that they are museumized, right? So that they can be curated in a museum, but actually to participate so that that can materially transform the everyday forms of doing things, how we go about doing things. And this question about AI and disinformation, I think it's a really good one, particularly within the context of the post-truth society. So one of the things that, if you look at the latest Facebook reports, right, one of the most striking things in the Facebook papers is the extent to which Facebook feeds the hate factories, right? And of course, in India, this is really alarming and actually very concerning, because India has one of the largest hate factories fed by the RSS and the VHP. This is recognized through numerous sets of studies. And for Facebook, what is most concerning is the most hate comes out of India, particularly out of the RSS machinery. So the question within that context then with democracy is, how do we take back our everyday forms of democracy when democratic processes are being manipulated through disinformation? And to that, I go back to something I presented in my slide, which is again the everyday practices of democracy, but also democratizing knowledge and information structures through critical literacy and critical reflexivity, so that we build habits of critical reflexivity. I mean, I will give you an example that came out of the field work that I was doing with migrant workers while the first lockdown happened in India. And one of the things that we're pointing out is all the disinformation that they were getting through social media, where disinformation was weaponized. Things like, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Tablighi Jamaat disinformation, that there were Muslims that were apparently spitting on food, and that's how they were spreading COVID intentionally. Now, that kind of disinformation is weaponized in order to spread hate, right? So your only way to challenge that kind of disinformation is to build critical literacy, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with people in your networks, be it your friends, be it your family members, that circulate that kind of bullshit, right? They will tell you that, yeah, there were Muslims that were spitting on food. That's how COVID was spreading. So the question for us then, and this is the communication question, is how do we build critical literacy in order to challenge that kind of disinformation? That is our only basis to take back our democracies.
Thank you so much, sir. These questions are very problematic, and I'm sure our audience got your answers perfectly. Sir, though I belong to the Jharsuguda, and these areas are also known from at least from a decade that these are urban industrial areas like Bhushan, Vedanta. And now I have realized in grassroots level that what kind of development is going on, what you have clearly termed as a whitewash of Vedantas, and how they are covering this in the name of other publicities. Sir, can you give me one example among all these industries in the world, and which industry particularly can be a role model for Indian subcontinent, Indian people? A company or industry which is doing a sustainable development. These companies, they can bring development as well as without ignoring the people. One example, sir, I want.
Neha, I think, part of that is that we have to interrogate our ideas of development to begin with in terms of what do we mean by development. No? So I will give you an example of Maori enterprises, because Maori run indigenous enterprises here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that are run by what they call iwi, which are tribal structures. So an example of this is what's called Manuka honey. I don't know if you have heard of honey. Honey is one of New Zealand's most prized exports to the world globally. And Manuka honey is sort of created through bee farming. Now, bee farming is an example of natural, sustainable farming, but also one that is shaped by indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous practices. So I think that I just gave that as one example. I think that if you look globally, you can find examples of indigenous-led organizations and organizing structures that are finding ways of building sustaining practices in the midst of this climate disaster, right? And what drives that is that concept of kaitiaki that I talked about, which is how are we going to be the stewards for our future generations, right? So in that sense, you see, the question doesn't start from here is a business model and then how do we do CSR properly? I have written many critical pieces about CSR because CSR becomes a way for whitewashing capital. So I think that rather than start from CSR, one has to really ask for indigenous communities when they actually participate in notions of creating sustaining forms of life and livelihood. What do those forms look like?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, if your time allows, I would like to ask one small question, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure,
absolutely, Vikram.
Sir, from Gramsci to Habermas and from Mohan to Samred, sir, what is important? The content is important or this community is important? When you look back and the serious issues always overlooked by this Indian academia and the universities is concerned, what you rightly point out in A square, but I will add one more AQ, the Adani, Ambani and Agrova. These people are always, the multinational affairs always try to a little bit problematic for these communities first. If you go to investigate and encounter the whole Niyamgiri movement, no university should be in favor of these collapsing movements. These movements are radicalism related to Gandhian way of study, and these people are protesting their nature, culture, language, and identity, the motherland first. But no university so seriously look upon these serious issues. What is your observation, sir? And what is your suggestion for these our old and new model of public and private universities of India? What would they rather go for this sustainability in terms of this pragmatic flagship of these agendas?
Vikram, as always, what a powerful question. I think that, the first thing is that, the way in which the universities are structured, they are structured in the colonial model. So they are structured in a way to be extractive. So we are trained as academics to extract. So most of us, for instance, when we think about the communities we work with, even when we work with Adivasi people, we gather data from them, and then we publish our pieces, we publish our ethnographic writing, we publish in journals. So that is extractive because that is not directed toward the community. That is not directed toward this question of how do we place our body on the line in solidarity with struggles of communities, particularly of Adivasi people. So, in the culture-centered approach, we talk about one of the key concepts is the idea of reorienting ourselves, so that the process of theory generation happens from within the lived struggles of the Adivasi people. So in that sense, then, the question is, how do we reorient ourselves? First, learning to place our bodies on the line in solidarity with the struggles of the Adivasi people, and recognizing that the work of theory generation will happen from within that struggle by being in solidarity with that struggle. So I think, the reason why much of academia, be it in India or be it in many other parts of the world, doesn't really connect with these struggles is because the ways in which the academia is incentivized with the corporate capitalist structure, there are that process of learning and pedagogy itself is extractive. We are taught to take and sort of reproduce so that we can benefit ourselves, benefit our careers, and follow a linear trajectory. So I guess in that sense, there is quite a bit of rethinking to be done in terms of what does it mean to practice humility? What does it mean to practice listening? What does it mean to actually place ourselves in solidarity in the struggles of, amidst the struggles of people? So that means that community is not just some place that you engage with one time and then you're done, but community is where we all live. Community is where we are immersed. So community is where knowledge takes place, so that the academia, and this is something that the Maoris say very nicely, that learning happens on the marae. Marae is where the Maori come together as a community. So that shifts or decenters or decolonizes the idea of learning away from the university and structure of the university and the walls of the university and out into the community. So when I say that, learning happens through lived struggles, like when you were looking at the women farmers and they were plotting on the field and thinking what they're going to plant, that is where the knowledge is being generated. So the imperative for us is, how do we learn to learn from below and decenter then the spaces in terms of where we think learning takes place, right? That and that is a real challenge for me because, Bikram, a lot of my own teaching happens in the classroom. So what then would it mean for me to be actually learning to learn from community outside of my everyday research and public scholarship in communities, right? And so, I have started experimenting with things like, I work with my students on food drives, where we work with food banks to volunteer to bring food into different communities that are facing hunger. And then we do the learning while we are traveling on the bus to the bank, food bank, or when we are traveling on the bus to the communities to give the food, or while after giving the food, we find a tree or a common space where we sit down and we actually talk about an idea. This is very similar to, Rabindranath Tagore's idea of Shanti Niketan, the open university, where learning happened in the midst of the trees, out in the open, in the community. So I think that is part of that decolonization process.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And sir, what is your ideas on this Eurocentric notion and this Americanization theory? Brain drain or brain in?
That's a hard one, because I think that, on one hand, clearly, there are people that migrate out. And I think of myself as having migrated out. And therefore, I really wonder what are my commitments to the community where I grew up, right? And that is something that, Maori, as the indigenous people of New Zealand, they teach very well. They say that they teach their kids that you go and learn, but once you have learned, you come back to the community and you take care of the people and make sure that you contribute to their well-being. And I think, Bikram, with that question, that in itself is a decolonizing idea, that how do we have to rearrange our seductions and our desires, right? What do we desire toward? What do we aspire toward?
Thank you so much, sir. And sir, you are sitting in New Zealand and you are telling the truth of this Niyamgiri. that is called your inability or capability. Well, in terms of your thinking, your ideology and your speculation related to these communities, how you engaging these ideas, particular how to preserve their nature and culture, and your campaign of flagship policy for social change. This is really outstanding, sir. With this note, I would like to invite Professor B.C. Das to go further and carry forward the session.
Yeah. Namaskar, sir. Namaskar. If time permits, I have a small question for you, sir. The point rightly raised by CARD Director Dr. Vikram Jena, that is preservation of tribal culture. Relating to that, I have a small question. When we talk of the great ideas like inclusion, democracy, and development, why or what factors prompt us or compels us to have a negligence towards the indigenous knowledge of tribal people, or the epistemology of the traditional knowledge of tribality and tribal culture? So this is one thing. Have we neglected their culture, or their have we neglected in accepting their ideas or indigenous knowledge? Really, this is one thing. Another thing is, when we talk of the modern education, and we are very much anxiety and to impose upon our ideas on them, and that is mainstream. In the name of mainstream education, we are imposing, like we are creating imposing like situation while educating them. Number two. Number three is my question is, why we should not use that indigenous knowledge in accommodating, while accommodating our curriculum in our education system. Already studies have reported regarding one study. I can say that there is a strong relationship between culture and mathematics in case of Saura tribe. You might have visited the Saura region in Odisha, South Odisha. So there is a strong relationship between culture and mathematics. With regard to their, if you say house construction, architect, and or doing agriculture, or doing you may say that is what in marketplaces, how to purchase and how to sell the commodities. So if there are evidences, research evidences regarding their culture, their scientific knowledge, why we are not accommodating their knowledge in our mainstream education? So this is my point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. I think those are great points. And I think, the starting point is the epistemology that shapes our curriculum. In communication studies, for instance, I can tell you that it is shaped by what we call whiteness. It is white, Eurocentric ideas that shape how we think about the world and conceptualize it and map it. So that actually also then gets percolated into education systems across the global South, particularly in terms of reproducing that modernization framework, where indigenous people are conceptualized as primitive and therefore incapable of knowledge. So as you rightly point out, Dr. Das, I think part of our challenge then, so that decolonization is about decolonizing the curriculum, exactly like what you're saying, the Sura tribe and their cultural understanding of mathematics, for instance, that, actually decolonization is incorporating those forms of knowledge into our knowledge systems. But that also means that, you know, like we have seen with the struggles of the indigenous people, like the Maori in New Zealand, they have had to really fight for it through advocacy and through activism to decolonize and to change the curriculum, and for them to actually incorporate Kaupapa Maori, which is, you know, Maori theories into the curriculum. So the same thing, I think, in terms of indigenous and Adivasi knowledge in India, that we need these ongoing advocacy and voices like yours to really push for, you know, transforming the curriculum and what is being taught to our students in the curriculum. Now, here is the strange part, you know, on one hand, we see that indigenous knowledge, Adivasi knowledge is sort of continuing to be silenced and erased. And on the other hand, we see another phenomenon, which is, you know, this turn toward sort of hegemonic forms of decolonization, such as you know, there are school curriculum and textbooks that are teaching things like, you know, there were rockets in the time of Mahabharata. Now, that is not really decolonization. That is cultural muscularism in order to make some dominant narratives. Decolonization is truly to create the space so that, you know, Adivasi forms of knowledge can find their entry points. So I think, Dr. Das, that struggle is actually the work of activism and academics to be activists for that space to be created, you know?
Yeah. Now this is time for a vote of thanks. I would like to request my colleague Dr. Shravan Bagh from Sambalpur University. I am from Ravensa University. He is from Sambalpur University. I request him to give a vote of thanks with a concluding comments.
Hello, Dr. Das, am I audible?
Audible.
Hi, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Dr. Das. And as I could see, the evening is approaching at Professor Dutta's place, and he have perfectly set the stage for all of us. So without wasting any more time, let me to take this opportunity and offer a vote of thanks on behalf of the organizing committee and the partnering institutions. Thank you, Professor Dutta, for such a lovely, in-depth and valuable talk, unfolding the real stories and also flagging a larger level political hegemony and the economic exploitation, the real cases and examples that you have cited, that is really hitting the deck. So if I conclude and if I summarize the discourse that has given by Professor Dutta, is as we see that decolonization as an issue or as a concern is not confined to any particular region. Rather, it is a global phenomenon. Further, it should not be restricted to displacement or destroying the natural habitat of people. Rather, it is all about questioning or the question about the existence, the very existence of a civilization and its cultural capitals. So given this backdrop, it is high time to create and provide space as well as platform to put forth their voice. What Professor Dutta has rightly mentioned, that it is time to create and to innovate a model which is not top down in its approach, rather a developmental model in its true sense, that gives and allows space and platform to showcase their voice and to give them their rights. So, and of course, indigenous pedagogy has to be the cross-cutting theme that respects their identity. So thank you so much, Professor Dutta, for really putting those lively cases and stories before the audience and giving us such a insightful talk to enlighten us with this very, I would say, very burning and very pertinent issue. Thank you so much. On behalf of the entire organizing team, the partner institution and organizations, we are very much thankful for your valuable time and the insight that you have shared with us. At the outset, let me also take this opportunity to thank all our mentors, our advisors, starting from the director IIM and all the partnering institutions who have always been instrumental in showcasing and giving us their technical input as well as moral boost up to organize such a deliberation which is unique in its own approach. Probably this is first time any organization is holding such kind of deliberation at a large scale. So we would also like to thank our all partnering organizations, our mentors, our advisors for giving their time, support and guidance. Last but not the least, our participants who have always been very patient and very active in this discourse, putting forth their very genuine question and also expressing their concern and their likeness to such kind of dialogue, which is very rare to see on a public platform like this. So thank you all participants, all the listeners who are connected with us in different social platforms. Now, before I conclude, let me also take this opportunity to invite Professor Dutta to Odisha, and of course, a special request would be from my side to come down to Western Odisha and to see how different kind of initiative that has been taken at different places, because I have been associated with this this particular movement from last couple of years, almost a decade now. And sir, just to your knowledge, there are two innovations that we have done in this part. Like we have initiated a kind of movement where we have developed a seed bank and seed exhibition kind of activity just to protect the indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices, which is also combating the climate change at a large. So, taking this discourse to another level, let me put two very pertinent questions, probably CARD as a committed organization for this cause. Can we do such kind of stories where we can really see how does this climate change is being affected in tribal areas and non-tribal areas? Because such kind of practices to a large extent is also combating the climate change. So this is one area probably Professor Dutta can help us, and CARD is always ready to do this. And also on behalf of the organizing team, and of course from my personal interest also, Professor Dutta, it would be really nice if you could help us to put all these kind of cases into one fold, and how can we put this discourse as a global agenda. So if you could help us in these two directions, probably we all together can bring a desired change that we are all looking for. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your valuable time, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shravan Kumar, and thank you, Professor Mohan Dutta, for your near about 135 minutes I will take on today. Thank you so much, sir, and namaskar.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to coming to Odisha. And also, the thing about perhaps showcasing the case studies. Let's talk about it. Maybe there is a book idea there, an edited book that brings these things together.
Sir, you must visit to one village called in Keonjhar district. That village is called the Widow Village. No males are available in that particular village. Some company came from Delhi and started a company. Then after all males are died in their particular area. You must visit this place, sir.
Wow.
Your friend Samarendra sir last time visited with me, sir, and this is my formal invitation to you. Just visit and try to highlight these issues in global phenomena, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Namaskar, and thank you so much. It was a pleasure joining you all.
Thank you, sir, and looking for future engagement also, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Namaskar.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.